Going through a divorce is one of life's hard things. Going through a divorce when you have shared children starts to become critically important that you have good tools to get through it. If you have Cptsd and if your ex also has Cptsd, this is a really hard area, and if it's not done well, it can really bring on trauma for the whole family, and in particular the kids. I grew up that way. I was a divorced mom when my kids were 1 and 4, so I went through that. But now I have a set of tools I can share with you about how to share custody with kids positively with an ex. So today I'm going to read a letter from someone I'll call Stephanie, who wrote to me about a situation. And I'm just going to read it, and you can see what her situation is, and then I'll respond to her, and I'll teach some general points about this. Okay, so Stephanie writes, I'm 43 years old and strongly believe I have Cptsd. I haven't been formally diagnosed, but I'm on an intense journey of self-discovery, and I've only recently realized the impacts my childhood trauma has had on my life. I have all the markers of Cptsd. This realization, or the aha moment, only came to light this past year, and I lament that it has taken so long. Your channel has been a wonderful positive force in my life during this journey. Just getting my pencil here. I'm going to go over this letter a second time, and that's when I'll comment on it, but I'm just going to read it through, maybe circling a couple things here. I grew up in a very broken, immature home. My parents had me when they were just 18, and I was an unwanted child, born from a high school romance. They were briefly married, but divorced when I was 4, acrimoniously. My mother has severe narcissistic tendencies, and my father was addicted to drugs and alcohol. He was mostly an absent figure in my life, but I remember being with him when drugs were present. He passed away last year, and I hadn't spoken to him since I was in my early 20s. I still have a relationship with my mom, despite her narcissistic tendencies. While she can be very loving at times, I grew up feeling that I had to earn her love. Due to my parents' divorce when I was very young, and also their own young age, 22 when they got divorced, my sister and I were bounced around with grandparents and aunts and uncles to take care of us in their absence, because my mom and dad couldn't. I remember being in my mom's custody even at the age of 7, and her not taking us to school. Instead, we spent days on end living at her friends' homes with nothing to eat except bread and jam, and making up games to play in the basements of whatever friend we were staying with. Friend is in quotation marks. She ignored us. No attention was paid to us. I have no memory of any affectionate or loving attention from her until I was roughly 10 when she remarried, and even then it was a fleeting battle for her time and affection. My mom also is a survivor of narcissistic parenting, and while she acknowledges this, she fails to address her own limitations. Her narcissism is still an issue today. My grandmother was not a kind person to my mother. Ours is definitely generational trauma. Okay. So then Stephanie says, there's a huge streak of trauma in my life that I continue to heal, but I could use your perspective on pointing me toward true north with respect to parenting. I've just gotten divorced, and I have a 4-year-old daughter with my ex-husband. Because of my past trauma and knowing it's generational, I'm a very dedicated parent to my daughter, and I'm constantly monitoring myself for narcissistic and codependent and unsavory tendencies when it comes to her. Perhaps I'm almost obsessive. I want her to have the healthiest upbringing possible, and I want to break this generational trauma. She is a really happy kid, and I feel that my awareness of these issues helps me to do a better job than perhaps I'm hardwired for. I realize now how my Cptsd contributed to the downfall of my marriage. I married someone who was very avoidant, and I worked overtime to make our marriage work. My approaches were sometimes too heavy-handed in an effort to offset his avoidance, and well, you know that doesn't work. If I could go back and do things differently on my end, I would. I wonder sometimes if my trauma was the sole reason our marriage didn't work, but I understand that his avoidance was a significant hurdle, and I'm trying very hard to work through this and not feel 100% to blame. My ex is a pretty good dad. He has limited emotional reserves, but he's attentive and kind to our daughter. He's not dad of the year, but he does sincerely try. Our daughter, who will turn 4 in March, is often excited to see him, but sometimes she cries when I drop her off. She's with me 70% of the time, but next year we'll be doing a 50-50 arrangement. I know developmentally that kids this age often have a favorite parent, and right now I'm my daughter's favorite. My ex's patience runs thin for toddler and kid antics, and I suspect he greatly enjoys his time alone without our daughter. He doesn't have a deep emotional well, but he does try to be a good dad, and my ex has trauma of his own that he's alluding to, but won't speak of. I sometimes suspect he could have Cptsd as well, but I don't know for certain. He's a stiff upper lip kind of person, and feelings are rarely talked about. He has a quick temper and tends to be an isolated sort of person. I know our daughter brings him a lot of joy, but I also suspect that one-on-one time with our daughter is not his favorite thing in the world. My question, in your experience, what are some best practices in raising a child with a healthy mental framework when there's a parent or both suffering from Cptsd? And similarly, how can two parents with trauma work together to raise a happy child and stop that generational trauma pattern? I suspect my ex will not attend counseling or therapy, individually or together, so this all might be a little lopsided. Thank you, Anna. All right. Stephanie, I'm so glad you wrote. I understand what you're doing a lot here. It makes a lot of sense. All right, so let's go through your letter again, and I'll look for pieces that I can pull out and highlight here. All right. So 43 years old, you think you have Cptsd, not formally diagnosed. Okay, most people haven't been. Here in the US anyway, it's not even recognized as a thing. Okay. You're on an intense journey of self-discovery. That's great. And you realize that the impact of trauma on you has made an impact on your life. You have all the markers of Cptsd, and realizing this only came to light in the past year. And you're sorry it took so long. Okay. And you grew up in a broken, immature home. From what you described, that sounds right. They had you when they were 18. I think when I was younger, I didn't fully grasp what that meant. But yes, 18 is very young. And if they themselves were from traumatized families and didn't have family support, I could see how that panned out the way it did. You weren't wanted. They were briefly married. They divorced when you were 4. There was a lot of fighting. Okay, I'm with you. Your mother has severe narcissistic tendencies, and your dad was an addict and alcoholic. So he was absent, but you did see him high or on drugs, but you hadn't spoken to him in years. That's so sad. I think being without a dad has some very predictable patterns in kids and a little slightly different in sons and daughters, but here we are. So we can make the best of what we have. So you still have a relationship with your mom, despite her tendencies. She can be loving sometimes, but you felt like you had to earn her love. Oh, when you got divorced, she just sort of like bailed on you emotionally and left you with relatives and so-called friends, and there wasn't enough food and nobody was paying attention to you. And I relate to that, and yeah, that'll do a number on you. And when you're a kid, you just roll with it. I mean, kids are so good at like being resilient, right? That we just, we sort of cheerfully go along with these things. And then at some point it comes out in some aspect of our life, and there's your chance to heal it. Always remember, Cptsd symptoms are pretty much there to protect you from what was unbearable to get through, that would have been destructive to your spirit as a kid. And so learning to check out, learning to be controlling, learning to go into a fantasy world, and all the things that we do, those were things that helped us survive and get us to this point in time when we can actually finally start unpacking and looking at what is going on inside. Okay. So, huge streak of trauma in your life, looking for perspective. You got divorced recently, and you have this 4-year-old daughter. And that's interesting because that's the age you were when your parents got divorced. I don't think that's magic. I don't think that's necessarily meaningful, but at least you know what it's like. And I'm so proud of you for trying to do something better than what you had growing up. I mean, that right there, if you want to do that and you can do it, you've just made the world a better place. And I don't often use the word generational trauma because there's very little trauma that isn't generational trauma. I mean, there's adult traumas, but just when it comes to childhood PTSD, it's almost always the trauma is coming from parents who themselves were traumatized. And I'm not saying that excuses it. I'm just saying why generational trauma is almost like redundant to say, right? Okay. So because of the past trauma, and it sounds like you've been really like waking up to it now, you're trying to get it right and you're trying to be dedicated. You're constantly monitoring. I'm circling that because I'll tell you what, later you said heavy-handed to try to solve problems with your husband. This immediately has a little bit of a ring to it that you're being heavy-handed. I totally get, like on one hand, I'm saying this is great, it's so good you're paying attention. But you say, I'm constantly monitoring myself for narcissistic, codependent, unsavory tendencies, and perhaps it's almost obsessive. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to take your word for it, and I'm going to say, I'm just going to assume you're right. It's kind of obsessive. Now, I'm not there. I don't know. There's always a chance you could be erring in the other direction, all right? So you take this with a grain of salt. But it sounds a little obsessive to me. The idea that you can prevent all trauma from passing on, like it's a good desire. But we're human in a human world and trauma happens. And no one of us has the power to like stop everything bad from happening. But a good parent tries. So I think your motives are very good. I want her to have the healthiest upbringing possible. And I want to break the generational trauma cycle. She's a really happy kid, good. And you realize now how your Cptsd contributed to the downfall of your marriage. Okay, so thing one, any kid whose parents are splitting up is having a trauma right now. That's just how it is. A divorce is traumatic for a child who's been living with both parents. So it sounds like she has a lot of inner resources to deal with this, but I want you to just like allow this to be true, that you have done the best you can and she's going through a trauma right now. And this trauma that she's going through will affect her. And I'm not saying, I'm not saying you have to like try to force the marriage back together on her behalf. That's not, in most cases, that's not the answer. The answer is healing. The answer is healing, but life is always going to have these hurts and healing is going to be necessary. So I'm just kind of busting up your perfect idea here that you can do everything right. It's like, well, you and me, we didn't, right? We didn't do everything right. Okay, so then you say, I married someone who was very avoidant, and I worked overtime to make our marriage work. All right, that's something that we do sometimes, and in fact, avoidant people are very attractive to individuals who have sort of an insecure attachment style and or are codependent. And codependent is a really different word to different people, but I'm not saying I think that you're a codependent. I think that's more where you're tilting here. And the funny thing about codependence, some people define it as, I just do stuff for other people. I'm always doing my best. They're messing it up. But the thing about codependence, the reason why it's like a disordered way to operate is that it involves being very, very clear about everybody else's flaws and having a difficult time seeing one's own flaws, which is where 100% of the focus needs to be. Not 100. You need a little bit of focus to detect if the father of your child is abusive or, irresponsible or something. You do need to pay attention to problems like that, but the rest of your energy goes to healing up yourself and what happened. And if you suspect that your behavior ruined the marriage, that is totally, like, now's the time to be looking at that and get some perspective on that. Okay, so then you said you thought your approaches were too heavy-handed in an effort to offset his avoidance. I understand that, but because you're asking for insight, I'm just going to say I'm hearing a number of phrases here where you're more in touch with the other person. And when you try to account for your own problem, you're like, I was too heavy-handed in trying to offset his avoidance. Like the sentence kind of flipped right there and blamed him for your heavy-handedness. And your healing is going to get stronger and clearer when you have worked this through enough that you can detach a little bit about what he did, which surely is present in the story, and then what you did, and focusing on that. I got heavy-handed. What is heavy-handed? I assume you mean that you got kind of controlling, you had a really clear idea how things needed to be, you tried to make him be that way. That's often how a partner of an avoidant person ends up being. And by the way, for people who have an avoidant partner and they find themselves going nuts about an avoidant partner, and I think this would be helpful information even if he's now your ex. There's a coach out there named Jason Gaddis, and it's Jayson, Gaddis. I see him on Instagram. I love him. He's talking to men about how to compensate for their avoidant nature. He's talking to women about how to compensate for the way they kind of get totally anxious around the avoidant behavior, and he and his wife work together to define what's a good balance between the two. It's a really common combination for us. In a way, it's a stable combination, as I understand it, reading about it, because the avoidant person, if they were with somebody who didn't have like this insecurity and sort of holding on to relationships, if they were with somebody who was more free with themselves and didn't want to put up with stuff, they wouldn't put up with an avoidant person. But an anxious person can't bear like breakups and they don't want to leave. I don't know if that's you, but I just thought people would be interested in that. They'll stay with an avoidant person. And there's a way to come together and have a better relationship, and it involves meeting in the middle. So Jason Gaddis, I'll talk more about this topic soon, and who knows, maybe I can bring him on here sometime. So you said that you were too heavy-handed sometimes to offset his avoidance, and she says, well, you know, that doesn't work. I do know. And if I could go back and do things differently on my end, I would. And then Stephanie says, I wonder sometimes if my trauma was the sole reason our marriage didn't work. I think it's interesting that you ask that. It sounds like you're carrying guilt. You're pretty unclear about your role and his role. And you know what? That's normal right after a breakup, but it'd be really good for you to have more clarity about that. So you do understand his avoidance was a significant hurdle, and you're trying hard to work through this and not feel 100% of the blame. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is just set your number at 50. Set your number at 50% of the blame. Just assume 50. Maybe it's 80, maybe it's 20, I don't know. But just assume 50% of the responsibility. It takes two to tangle. And everything you can learn about yourself that was destructive to the relationship is solid gold for your peace and happiness to be able to recover from what just happened, for you to be able to reflect healing for your daughter, and I'm going to talk more about that. I'm about to get to the parenting part here. All right. And then if you should, and you probably will, be in a new relationship one day, you can bring that much less baggage to it. You'll come in as somebody who's really good at kind of seeing her part in things. Think of how valuable it would be in your life if you always knew, wait, I want to say this, but actually that wouldn't be fair to the other person. You know, or I want to say this and I'm going to say it because I really need to set a boundary. Like if you always had that clarity, how many mistakes could you have avoided? So now's your chance. And that's what's so great about getting older than 40 is you have this clarity and opportunity to heal some stuff that might have been dogging you all your life. All right. So you say your ex is a pretty good dad. He has limited emotional reserves, but he's attentive and kind to your daughter. He's not dad of the year, but he does sincerely try. So I don't know if you can hear yourself, but you're really, really putting him down here. And I'm going to talk to you about that and why that's not good, even if you're right about everything. But I feel like the feeling I get from what you're saying here is this might be a pattern for you. You're trying to paint something as like, hey, I'm just being nice. I'm being fair. I'm being good-willed here. He is a good, he's very kind. He's a good dad. But, then you say three things that are just like really insulting to his fatherhood and his personhood. So I'm just going to say that. That's something you might want to look at. Okay. Our daughter, who's about to be 4, is often excited to see him, but sometimes she cries when I drop her off. Well, early on in a divorce, that doesn't necessarily mean disaster. But I'm going to tell you, if you want to help your daughter feel at peace with the divorce, you have to be at peace with the divorce. There's no more important thing you do is to achieve peace yourself and remove all drama. And, from what you're saying, it sounds like that's what you're doing. But I hear this, I guess you'd call it passive aggressive, these remarks about her dad. And I know how hard it is. I remember when I was getting divorced, and we're totally friends now. Like things have evolved so much for us, because we have kids together. So, you're going to have a relationship all your life. And it's evolved so much, but it was for about 2 years, my anger was really something. It was like a bucking bronco I was riding all the time. All right. Now, she's with you 70% of the time, but next year it's going to go 50-50. And you say, I know developmentally kids at this age often have a favorite parent, and right now you're the favorite. If you're wondering whether I'm worried she's not okay, I'm not. I'm not worried that the fact that she has a favorite or that she's crying, I'm not worried about that right now. If you had signs of abuse, I would be worried. But I think that's not what you're saying. And I trust you to be vigilant, like you're good at being vigilant. Okay. Then you say, my ex's patience runs thin for toddler and kid antics. And I suspect he greatly enjoys his time alone without our daughter. He doesn't have a deep emotional well, but he does try to be a good dad, and he has trauma of his own that he won't speak of. And sometimes you suspect he could have CPTSD as well, but you don't know. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether somebody has it or has been diagnosed. Everything that we look at here is in how are people feeling, how are they behaving. All right. Stiff upper lip kind of person, doesn't talk about feelings, quick temper, tends to be isolated. And you know that your daughter brings him a lot of joy, but you also suspect that one-on-one time with the daughter is not his favorite thing in the world. Okay, so that's interesting. It's important. What you're saying is describing somebody who's not a good person to have custody. And I'm not sure if you mean to say that, but somebody who can't really deal with kids. So if he's exactly as you say, yes, she should have a relationship with him. But I'm just questioning because earlier in the letter, you say, he's really nice, and then you kind of put the knife in about how he is. So it's hard for me to tell what you're saying. I'm not hearing you in a direct way, like having trouble understanding. Like, do you mean that he actually has a quick temper and doesn't have patience for kids? Because that might be something, that would not be good for a kid. Or, okay, here's another scenario. Now that he's not in a troubled marriage, he's going to relax a lot and it's going to get a lot better. I will say that certainly was the case for me. I mean, I never didn't want to be with my kids. I've always been really, really into my kids. When their dad and I finally separated, even though I was very upset about the separation and then divorce, I was so much calmer as a person, except when he came around. And he and I actually created a bunch of material for other parents, and I'm going to read to you from it about how to do this. He happens to be a family law attorney, and he helps other people do this, and I work with trauma, and we wrote it down. We wrote down the things that help, so I'm going to go through that. So what are some best practices? All right, for how to do this. And I pulled out our old handout from this, and this may be time to publish. I never published this course under Crappy Childhood Fairy because it's kind of outside of the realm of what we do. But if people would really like access to it, I will consider putting it out there. Okay. The first thing you can do is learn to re-regulate yourself. If you're not doing the daily practice, I really encourage you to learn these techniques that I teach everybody. It's free. You can find it in the links down below in the free tools page, on my courses page. It's everywhere. I just bombard everybody. Take the daily practice. You can learn it in less than an hour, and it's a way to just take that cluster of thoughts that you can't keep straight or know what's what and all that stress, and you can just keep bringing it out and have a calm mind and rest your mind and then carry on. And it's just so helpful for going through a hard time. When your daughter is around you, her nervous system is still very wired to yours and her dad's. So when you're dysregulated, she's going to dysregulate. When she dysregulates, if you get all dysregulated, the two of you are going to kind of spiral up. So if you know how to re-regulate and she gets dysregulated, you even just by holding her and touching her, you can start to impart re-regulation to her nervous system. And that is the most profound gift you can give a kid, is to be a regulated parent. So that's the first thing. If it seems like I'm lecturing you about this, I think you know some of this, but some of the points I want to make them generally for anybody who's in your shoes right now. So the first thing is, it's so important to put your kids' long-term well-being first. And so despite all the drama going on, despite all the misgivings and the fears about what's going to happen, that the long-term well-being of your kid comes first, and that means maintaining a good relationship with her dad. So for anybody splitting custody, the other parent, a good relationship is the high priority here. Stay regulated, now have a good relationship with the other parent. All right, some things you can do. Stop punishing the other parent. Show the kids through your own behavior and how you say things and what your energy is like that everything is going to be okay. That's what they look to. They look to you. Are we okay? Are we okay, Mom? And you show her not just with false words, but with everything about you. Yep, we're going to be okay. You need to find an outlet where you can vent your feelings about this, because you're going to have a lot of emotions. And the outlet cannot be him, and it can't be anywhere where your daughter's present. So those are two people who can't hear your feelings about this. Those two people are going to get a very veneered version of feelings, all right? Because they don't need to hear all of this, but you need to talk about it. When you're communicating with your ex, be kind in all your communications. Be kind. Refrain from any sort of insults. Learn to be really mindful about that. Don't talk to your daughter about what caused the breakup, unless it was drugs and alcohol or incarceration, we suggest. I say my ex and I, that you don't talk about the cause. The cause is usually something that would be very disappointing and scary to a kid, and they don't need to know, and maybe one day when they're older, you can tell them. If you do start dating, avoid introducing any new partners for a long time. It's so tempting to just like fit somebody into the old routine and be like, oh, we're taking this little day trip and why don't we all go? But don't do that. Don't introduce anybody to your kids until it's a real relationship. The last thing you want is a bunch of people coming and going out of her life. Just like a revolving door and coming into that role of like new dad. It's very hard for kids at first, I can attest. So I would say wait at least a year before your daughter meets who you date. And with split custody, you're going to have the opportunity to date without kids present. So that's one upside. You can also take classes. You can go to therapy. You can take yoga. You can exercise. You can have downtime. You can watch TV. All those things that you usually can't do when you're the parent of a young kid every day of the week. So there's your upside, that should help you stay regulated and happy. All right. So in conflict, you want to raise the level on the communication to a level you never had before. So that includes focus on your own side of the street, just as little as possible. Don't talk about what they're bringing to it. Keep your communication brief, just like a sentence or two. If you're sending emails, don't send long emotional emails about stuff. You'll never be glad you did it. Just a little brief email, kind, polite, what you did. If you get the email or the text, reply promptly. Don't keep the other parent waiting. The long-term interest of the kid is that you guys are in tight, frequent communication as needed so that the other person can make plans. When you anticipate a difficult situation, Christmas or some birthday party where you're both going to be, anticipate. Figure out what your exit plan is. Have somebody you can call or text, or maybe at the party, who can help you kind of like blow off steam so that you can show up present, especially if your daughter's there. This is a good one, and my ex taught me this one. Pay compliments to the other parent. Ask for their opinion. Boy, that goes like a million miles towards healing old wounds about fights and things that have happened. He would pay compliments to my parenting. He would ask me for my opinion. And I didn't know he was doing that at the time intentionally. But when we later sat down and told each other all of our bag of tricks about how to stop fighting and have a better co-parenting relationship, he told me that and I loved it. He also told me that he never came and took the kids from my house. He would ask me to drive the kids to his house and then he'd drive them to mine. And that way I never had that abandonment feeling of having people taken away from me. I was in control. I drove the car. And that was really good for me. That was very insightful. Okay. Communicate about discipline. You're going to need a common discipline plan. And that's going to be one thing that takes a lot of communication. So will school, homework, clothes, outside activities, birthday parties, friends. You're going to have a lot of communication about that and do the best you can to stay on the same plan. All right. Do not badmouth your ex. If you really have to have a talk with him about stuff that's bothering you, do that. But don't to anybody badmouth him. You will always be sorry. I mean, don't badmouth anybody if you possibly can. But badmouthing him, it's going to come back to haunt you. So this is the time to practice a higher level of communication than you've ever had. All right, so here's one that's particularly for you, Stephanie. Don't try to control the other parent's parenting style. Unless there's abuse and neglect, it's so important to let the other parent be the parent who they are. And I could hear you had all this, you said, I suspect, like 4 or 5 times. So I don't know if you're kind of like mind reading in an unhealthy way or if you're just trying to be polite about things you know very well about him. But unless there's abuse or neglect, you've got to let him be him. And you would hate it if somebody tried to tell you how to not be you as a parent too. So that is a really important one. It's a way to show respect. It's a way you can come together around all the logistics that you need to have together, but separate in terms of how you want to parent. And you're going to have disagreements sometimes, but with my ex, I think we did a really good job actually of agreeing. I'd call up and say, so-and-so's grounded. And here's why. He did this, or so-and-so got caught doing this. And we'd talk about it. We'd decide together what we felt that the consequences were going to be. And then whoever he was with could follow through on it, and if it was not going to end for a few days. And that communication allowed us to be consistent about discipline, which is really important for kids. All right. Don't use the other parent's shortcomings as an excuse to interfere. And that's what I'm hearing you have the temptation to do. Don't use the other parent's shortcomings as an excuse to interfere. So above all, try not to interfere. Let them parent the way they want unless there is abuse and neglect. Have communication with them in a constructive way. That's a little different than interfering, but in the end, they are sovereign over their parent style as long as it's not abuse and neglect, right? And there may come a time when something kind of gray area happens and you'll have to deal with that with support. And that's when I would suggest you talk to a counselor or a social worker or some good friends, or come back to the channel and write me a letter here and we'll talk about it. But you need to make decisions for the kids. This is one. All right. Instead of like, well, honey, where would you like to stay? You know, this thing where she cries, you make decisions about where she stays. If you guys are firm, it's like tonight's your daddy night. You're coming back here tomorrow. Not introducing a bunch of choice for her about that is age appropriate right now. You might be tempted to do it because it's hard for you to see her be sad, but it's comforting and boundaried for young kids. It's like you set the rules for this, okay? And finally, support easy and frequent communication between your daughter and her dad. If she wants to call him when she's with you, just support that. If she wants him to attend some school event and you think you might be uncomfortable, support it anyway. Unless you guys are going to fly into a fight, because above all, no fighting, no fighting. It dysregulates people with Cptsd and it's absolutely poison for the kid. So everything that you can do to accommodate her desire to have both of you in her life is good, And so I hope that helps you, Stephanie. You had asked what's my advice for how to prevent generational trauma. I don't know if you were expecting it would be all about you, just all about you, like taking good care of the co-parenting relationship and focusing on your own healing from Cptsd. If anybody out there thinks that you might have been affected by childhood trauma, I have my quiz, the Childhood PTSD quiz. It's right down below. You'll find it on my free tools page, which is linked at the very top of the description section under all my videos. You can also find that on my website at crappychildhoodfairy.com. If you're interested in a video about parenting, I've got a video lined up for you right here, and I will see you very soon.